Well, good afternoon. I'll get us started. I'm Bob Hathaway. I have the privilege of directing the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. And I have to confess that of all the 600 plus programs I've organized since joining the Wilson Center, I don't think any has given me greater pleasure because among the four of us here, among other things, you see 20 straight years of directorship of the Asia program. I'll explain that further in a minute, but I'm very conscious of the fact that I am standing on the shoulders of several giants, which is... We're giants. You are giants. I would like to, on a more serious note, convey some news that perhaps not everyone has heard, but a friend of ours, a name known to probably all of you, passed away earlier today, Bob Scalapino. Bob was widely recognized as the Dean of East Asia Studies in the United States, based for many decades at Berkeley. But his contributions to the study of modern Asia were unparalleled. And there could be 1,000 things to say about him, but one thing to say about him was he was one of the founders and the first chairman of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which is an organization which many of us in this room have participated in. One of our speakers was a president of that organization. So I simply want to acknowledge the great debt that every single one of us who pays attention to East Asia feels toward Bob Scalapino. Since we are webcasting this and being watched from around the world, please permit me to say just a word about the Woodrow Wilson Center. We are the nation's official memorial to President Wilson, who was so far, the only American president to hold a PhD. As all of you in this room certainly know, he was a distinguished academic long before he entered the unruly world of politics. And we seek here at the Wilson Center to commemorate President Wilson's twin concerns of good scholarship and good public policy. Now, to get on to the subject at hand today, we are here to celebrate the publication of a new book published by the Wilson Center Press. Copies of the book are on at a special discount, are on sale right outside this door. If you get a copy today, I will guarantee you a savings of $5. If you buy 5 copies, I'll guarantee you a savings of $25. Christmas is coming up, other holidays. So I encourage you to think carefully about your holiday gift selections. Leave today. The book is The Oil Prince's Legacy, Rockefeller, Philanthropy in China by Mary Bullock. There's lots of things to say about Mary. You have seen her biography, so I won't try to say all I might. But simply to say that in 3 different incarnations, she's been one of ours. She was, for a period of 7 years, beginning in 1988, the director of the Asia program here. She then moved on to a relatively minor job as the president of a major college, Agnes Scott College. My wife sometimes asks me when I'm going to go on to a big job. But Mary ran Agnes Scott for 11 years. She then came back here as a scholar, where I think she got heavily involved in the writing of this book. She teaches at Emory now, but she's also a senior scholar here, even if we don't see her quite as often as we would like. So Mary, will turn things over to you, and then I will introduce our other two commentators who will have somewhat briefer comments on Mary's book. Mary.
Thank you, Bob. And I must say, coming back to the Wilson Center, it really is coming full circle several times around and seems like a wonderful place to talk about this book. I did get started on it as I left being a college president. Coming back to the Wilson Center was the perfect place to really divest myself of administration and to try to see if I could write a book that I'd thought about for a long time. I see Joe Brindley in the back of the room, who's the publisher of the Wilson Press, and he encouraged me throughout, held my hand at many different points. He and his staff were very instrumental in making sure that this got finished ultimately and was published. So it's truly one. I see friends from many different parts of my life here, and that also is very exciting. They also know that although this is not a memoir, there is an autobiographical component in that I have been particularly conducting interviews in China for a long time about PUMC and thinking about the role of American philanthropy and American science in China. I'm also very honored and a little nervous by the two discussants here because I know they have both read the book. And so we will see, and each in their own way, a specialist in a different part of U.S.-China relations. So I look forward to a lively conversation. In 1863, John D. Rockefeller sold his first kerosene to China and made his first gift to China missions. He was 24 years old. He could not have dreamed that both his future company and his future foundation would one day dominate American commercial and cultural presence in China. Counterintuitively, the Rockefeller China story is America's China story. The first three John D. Rockefellers were engaged with China from the time of the Civil War to Deng Xiaoping's reform era. Across the 20th century, the Rockefeller investment in China's science, medicine, and higher education far outpaced any other American source, upwards of $1 billion. The Rockefeller China interest in commerce, in religion, in art, and in science really epitomize the multidimensional, non-governmental sources and interests that continue to shape U.S.-China relations. A century ago, American scientists looked to Europe for training, especially in science. Few imagined an era when scientific collaboration with China could become a priority, or that American-educated Chinese would dominate China's scientific elite. How did this happen? What forces brought together this close encounter between the knowledge communities of the world's largest developing country and the world's greatest 20th century power? And we can ask, looking ahead, how will China's rise as a global power change the nature of America's cultural relations with China? The core thesis of my book is that the Rockefellers' sustained philanthropic emphasis on elite science and medicine legitimated an American secular presence in China. It nurtured a tradition of professional relationships that survived even the upheavals of Mao's era. The success of the Rockefeller agenda was due in no small part to the convergence of Chinese and Rockefeller priorities. Unlike the Jesuits centuries before them, the Rockefellers were lucky in their timing. Modern science became an important component of China's 20th century revolutionary ideology, from the May 4th movement to the Kuomintang state building to Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations. Throughout the century, and even in some respects during the 1950s and 1960s, the Rockefeller philanthropic mission was compatible with China's broader quest to harness science in support of its quest for national wealth and power. At the heart of the Rockefeller agenda was the aim to create a scientific community unbounded by national or political boundaries. During the first part of the 20th century, the Rockefeller Foundation was the most important organization which promoted and financed international scientific and medical communities. Early on, it extended what had been the really transatlantic flows of people to the Pacific. That China was from the very first included in this orbit has really made a significant difference in the scientific life of the United States and of China. In the 1980s, when the Rockefeller Foundation and its former subsidiary, the China Medical Board, re-entered China, the agenda in many respects was the same. How to restore China's scientific institutions, how to elevate them to world levels, and how to renew China's membership in a global intellectual community. This agenda has differed from that of many other U.S. foundations and non-governmental groups entering China since 1980. Many have chosen to work on more politicized topics such as law, governance, civil society, and the social sciences. Certainly, the continuing compatibility between the Rockefeller agenda and the Chinese agenda has ensured relatively open political space in the People's Republic of China, not really very much different from its work experienced in the Republican era. This book presents Rockefeller philanthropy as a case study of multi-layered cultural internationalism, weaving together four narrative themes: the Rockefeller family, professional philanthropy, Chinese recipients, and U.S.-China relations. Today, I thought I would touch on the Rockefeller family story, a case study of Chinese recipients, and some of the future challenges in U.S.-China cultural relations. You know, this has been a wonderful project to work on, in part because of the nature of the research I've been able to do. This is particularly true of the ability to interview in China, but it's also true because of the diaries and the personal letters that have been available from the Rockefeller family. Those diaries and letters, and this, of course, was a letter-writing era, the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and this family was a letter-writing family, really gave an intimate glimpse into how America's wealthiest family encountered China, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing today. Just last week, David Rockefeller Jr., who's the chairman now of the Rockefeller Foundation, took his wife on a pilgrimage to revisit Peking Union Medical College, the original flagship of the Rockefeller Foundation in China. Several years ago, members of the fourth and fifth generation gathered in Beijing to dedicate a Chinese statue of John D. Rockefeller. They followed by about 90 years John Jr. and his wife Abby's 1921 trip, an almost epic journey which has been replicated by each succeeding generation. This family keystone memory was intensified a year later when Chinese bandits kidnapped Abby's sister, Lucy Aldrich, daughter of Senator Aldrich of Rhode Island. You can just imagine the outcry in the family and in the nation when this happened. A number of people were kidnapped. Despite family consternation and international publicity, Abby wrote Lucy when she was released, "I am sure this incident will not kill your love of China any more than it does ours." Such was the almost romanticized, definitely romanticized feeling of kinship and affinity with China. This family's growing affinity for Asia actually predates their philanthropic involvement, and it's intrinsically interesting, but it's also important. As early as the 1920s, John D. Jr. and Abby's, their worldview came to encompass Chinese religion and Chinese art, and the conviction that China mattered, not just culturally, but politically as well. Their 6 famous children, Babs, John III, Nelson, David, Winthrop, and Lawrence grew up frolicking in Asian gardens, tiptoeing through Buddha rooms, and eating on antique Asian china. Their family embrace of Asian peoples and civilization influenced American China perceptions, in part because of their prestigious social and economic position, but I think even more because their cosmopolitan values influenced the institutions they created, institutions which are still influential today. Previous interpretations of the Rockefeller China story have primarily linked the Rockefeller motivation to religious, commercial, and cultural imperialism. Certainly missionaries, Standard Oil in China, and a confidence that science will bring about democratic values are part of the Rockefeller story. But the family's encounter with Asia also reveals a more nuanced, two-way experience. And I'll just give a few examples. Abby Rockefeller was profoundly influenced by Buddhism. One of her grandsons, Stephen Rockefeller, became a professor of comparative religion at Middlebury College and a practicing Buddhist. John Jr. himself, a really pious Baptist, American Baptist, eventually became very critical of missionaries in China and adopted a Universalist creed, which is carved on the portal of Rockefeller Center in New York. It's really interesting. You can go to Rockefeller Center today and you can see this creed written over the portal. It concludes, "I believe in an all-wise and all-loving God, named by whatever name." There are also, of course, commercial linkages, but not those anticipated in earlier critiques. I found no evidence that there was an explicit linkage between Standard Oil's fortunes in China and Rockefeller philanthropy, although they are proceeding in an almost parallel line through China and at the same time. And there is a lot of interchange between them, but mainly in terms of support for the Rockefellers' philanthropic endeavor. But I have found nothing that shows sort of philanthropic pressure on the Chinese government. Now, I don't know. There's some Chinese colleagues that are working on this more closely, and it'll be interesting to see actually what they uncover. But the Rockefellers certainly didn't hide their connection to Standard Oil, and they were really perceived for who they were. You might say the son of John D. Rockefeller, the financial magnate, and a leading philanthropist. Those dual identities they carried with them. When they traveled to China, they visited Standard Oil offices as well as medical schools. And I was interested at Tiffin with Shanghai's Chinese Chamber of Commerce in 1921. Junior spoke about business success and philanthropy in much the same way that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates entertained Chinese billionaires last summer. And the Chinese response was quite similar. They rejected Rockefeller's paternalistic lecture, and they proceeded to give a lengthy and detailed account of their own support of educational and medical charities. There is a verbatim record of this dialogue in 1921. I think it's an absolutely fabulous encounter. A final point about the family. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., dominated and almost micromanaged Rockefeller China philanthropy from the early 20th century, when he oversaw his father's gifts to the YMCA, until the mid-1950s. He died in 1960. His views were often at variance with those of the professional staff in New York or in Beijing, but he prevailed, especially with regard to Peking Union Medical College, to which he often referred as family, using family terms, as a grandchild, or when he became irritated because they wanted to be more independent, he called PUMC their stepchild. I found this also quite fascinating use of family terminology. But there's no question that it is largely due to his influence that PUMC became, and still is, the third largest beneficiary of Rockefeller funds, after the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University. Fascination with the family aside, and Warren's going to tell you that I'm in love with the Rockefellers, so I'm going to preempt you right away. The heart of my book is really about Chinese institutions and individuals funded by Rockefeller Philanthropy. Several hundred Chinese institutions and many thousands of Chinese scholars and practitioners received Rockefeller support across the century. Based on multiple studies of science in Republican China, as well as my own, I conclude that the Rockefeller Foundation was the most significant foreign influence on China's medicine and science during the first half of the 20th century. Always intent on exporting the cutting edge of American ideas, Flexnerian medicine, the empirical social sciences, or later experimental biology, the Rockefeller presence sustained China's strongest scientific institutions and nurtured transnational professional networks. That a distinctly modern, distinctly Chinese intellectual agenda, coupled with international linkages, developed during these formative years of China's modern university development, has had lasting effects. Given that Americans controlled the funds, and actually the Rockefeller presence in Republican China was the most there were at least 5 or 6 different Rockefeller-funded organizations with interlocking boards and interlocking family or philanthropic sort of principles. You would sort of touch an institution or an American source of funding, and you found that the original source was actually had something to do with the Rockefellers. So it's much more complicated than just the Rockefeller Foundation itself. And the Americans did control the funds. Given that the Americans controlled the funds and the decision-making and were the more advanced scientific partners, most of these linkages can be characterized as patron-client relations. Even so, the clients or recipients were often innovators as well. And my book talks about a number of those examples. This trans-Pacific network of scholars became an accepted part of the intellectual culture of the United States and the Republic of China. If religion had dominated the relationship in earlier decades, American medicine, science, and higher education prevailed in later decades. A case study of Peking Union Medical College and its graduates enabled me to trace the influence of Rockefeller science and medicine across the 1949 divide, when all-American funding and contacts ceased. In a sense, this is a wonderful experiment that you don't often have as a social scientist, this total break for 25 years between the original source of funding. It meant that Chinese institutions couldn't continue to be dependent on American largesse, and they were really quite largely isolated. But what I discovered was three points that I would like to make. One is that 75% of PUMC graduates before 1950 remained in China. A significant number went to Taiwan. Interestingly, some of the most progressive ones, because they had been identified with Chiang Kai-shek's public health administration. So they had to flee when Chiang Kai-shek left. Others went, and a number went to the UN, to the World Health Organization, and some went to the United States. But 75% of them remained in China and became the leaders of modern medicine, presidents of medical colleges, founders of professional disciplines, editors of major journals, directors of important hospitals. One Chinese scholar who actually is from PUMC's competitor institution called PUMC the cradle of modern medicine in China. And he meant cradle is a wonderful term here he really meant the birthplace and the nurturing, the place from which many of the modern medical disciplines came forth. Second point, these graduates, and really most interestingly, their successor graduates, and I've been fortunate to interview from the 1980s until 2 or 3 years ago, so I've interviewed the successor graduates as well as some of the old-time PUMC graduates, form a remarkably cohesive intellectual community, stubbornly adhering to their original American model of elite training. My interviews in a host of Chinese publications in the last 2 decades reveal an extraordinary professional and emotional identification with PUMC's original American medical model, its values, and its professional standards. Memories of this old PUMC, and they talk about it, it's the old PUMC, have been really enshrined, romanticized, passed down, often sub rosa, for 6 decades. Third point, PUMC itself has survived as an institutionally coherent, self-perpetuating institution that has retained a fair measure of its professional autonomy despite being closed for over 20 years. Given the intensity and duration of attacks against American-educated scientists and institutions, this persistence, it actually has become really an anachronistic persistence, seems quite surprising. The concept of epistemic communities is helpful in understanding the role of these memories and the efforts to preserve PUMC's distinct culture. An epistemic community is a knowledge community with a shared sense of values and norms, which can be transnational in its professional identity. This particular study demonstrates that even in an authoritarian country, an epistemic community was able to replicate itself and preserve a shared sense of professional identity. Let me turn now briefly to the future. Despite a recent Foreign Affairs article, China is no longer the sick man of Asia. Wholesale Chinese investment in its own knowledge, scientific, and cultural infrastructure dwarfs any contribution from an American organization. China's rapid advancement in science today is seen as a competitive challenge to the United States, a potential future weapon to be used against us. How can the Rockefeller philanthropies, so vested in this commitment to international science, to transnational science, make a difference today? It's very interesting that after almost a century of work in China, the Rockefeller Foundation itself decided to end most of its China programs. It decided it didn't want to continue funding a country that could fund its own science, even though Rockefeller Foundation programs were very carefully selected, some in controversial areas, reproductive sciences, agricultural biotechnology, and some other fields. The Rockefeller Foundation shifted its resources from China to poorer regions of Asia and Africa. The other Rockefeller-funded philanthropies have also had that debate. Is it time to leave China? Both the China Medical Board, and I do serve on the China Medical Board, so I need to note that, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund have shifted resources away from institution building, really feel that this is the Chinese government's responsibility. It has plenty of its own money. And so they've tried, or in the midst of trying to identify their agenda more on the cutting edge of some of the same fields, but how they affect society and in a more politicized arena. Equitable access to basic health services, grassroots work on the environment and human health, sustainable approaches to energy and to civil society. One can only speculate whether these efforts to engage the more progressive aspects of China's own agenda will make any difference. And so in concluding, I come back to my title. What is the oil prince's legacy? Let me list 4 things, and these really refer to China. First, a China-based model of elite medical training, clinical expertise, medical research, and preventive medicine comparable to many around the world, which helped China to build its modern medical infrastructure throughout the 20th century. 2, an ongoing debate over the shortcomings of this very model, this very American model. Flexnerian curative medicine, which has been the dominant form of our medicine in terms of medical education, it really enshrines the sort of very high level education for medical practitioners and an elevated role for physicians. Flexnerian curative medicine failed to address the health needs of China's population, not to say also our own. This debate was going on throughout the era of the Rockefeller involvement in China, and it continues. 3, a scientific and medical community whose professional identity and trans-Pacific ties were influenced by American values during their formative years, sustained during Mao's China and renewed over and over again since. Time will tell whether the now almost century-old epistemic linkages between the American and Chinese intellectual communities will continue to serve as a bridge between what divides us. And 4th, a social model which integrates wealth and philanthropy. Chinese fascination with John D. Rockefeller and his philanthropy is blossoming. Not only is there a Rockefeller Research Institute in China, a statue, what I referenced, a statue of John D. Rockefeller was auspiciously and quite frankly lovingly cast to meet various Chinese auspicious elements, both in terms of its size and its current placement. CCTV has already broadcast several programs which focus on John D. Rockefeller's history in America, and a new 10-part series on his medical and educational philanthropy. A new CCTV series is in the works. Who would have believed that the capitalist oil prince, exemplar of American imperialism in the 1950s, would resurface in the 21st century as a model in China for philanthropy and economic success? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think you gave everybody in the room another incentive to go out and buy one or more copies of the book. I will now turn to Warren Cohen, who reminds me that, in fact, he's not affiliated with the University of Maryland. We have mislabeled him. He is Distinguished University Professor of History and Presidential Research Professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Warren, we do recognize the difference, and we meant no insult. I first knew Warren when I still thought I might be an American diplomatic historian, because already at that point Warren was one of the leading historians of American foreign relations. He has written more books than you and I can count. He succeeded Mary as the director of the Asia program, and got things straight enough so that when I came 3 years later, I didn't foul him up too terribly much. I will simply mention one of his, I think, My staff told me you have 18 books to your credit, which
19.
I insulted him. Well, I'm not going to mention all 19 of them, but I will mention simply one of them, America's Response to China, because it's been so influential, and it's now in, unless he corrects me again, it's in its fifth edition. Jeez, Warren, I can't keep up with you. I'm going to simply shut up and turn things over to you.
Thanks very much, Robert. I'm delighted to be here with Mary again. Mary, as director, left the program in such terrific shape that I only had to be here one day a week to run it. And I thought that was great. She also had raised enough money so that I was not dependent on the Wilson Center to pay my staff or to run programs or to have dinner parties. So it was just a wonderful 3 years or so. And I tried to explain to Bobby that he would be much better off working only one day a week, but his experiences on the Hill made that impossible. Now, those of you who have bought a copy of the book, or those of you who are about to buy a copy of the book, if you look at the back cover, you will see that I like it.
It's such tiny.
The author is one of those rare individuals, and I'm sitting here surrounded by them, who combine superb administrative skills with superb scholarship. That's also Robert and also Mike, but I think Mary does us all, leaves us all behind. All of us who work in this field are indebted to her for her insights into Chinese-American cultural relations, most obviously the many contributions of the Rockefeller family. But remember, there was much more to what Mary's been doing over the last 30 years than just looking at the Rockefeller family. There are two subjects Mary writes about in this book that I have written about myself, and where I can elaborate on her work. First of these is art collecting, and second, the conflict between John Jr. and John III on the one hand, and a man by the name of Roger Green on the other in the early 1930s. In both instances, I have a less favorable view of John III. I would argue that his reputation as an art collector is vastly overrated, and I would also stress his arrogance and argue that he and his father were appallingly insensitive to Chinese nationalism. Now, let's look at the art collecting quickly. Mary notes that John Jr. had an important collection of Chinese porcelains, some of which ended up at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, which had just begun collecting those porcelains in 1879. I had not realized until I read Mary's book that the Rockefellers had developed an interest in these porcelains by visiting the home of a man by the name of Benjamin Altman, also an early collector who also helped shape the Metropolitan's interest in Asian art. This was an area in which New York lagged far behind Boston, and the Metropolitan was well behind the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in terms of collecting Asian art. Now, one of the things that occurs to me as I look around the room is that most of you are too young to remember who Benjamin Altman was. How many of you remember that B. Altman's was a high-end department store in Manhattan? There were about 4 of us, 5 of us, 6 of us in the room. That's not bad. I mean, that's a fourth of us present. Well, John III carried on the family tradition and became, as Mary demonstrates, an avid collector with a deep interest in Asian cultures and in Asian American cultural relations. Indeed, she points out that John Foster Dulles invited him to join him when he negotiated the peace treaty with Japan in 1951, when we ended the occupation of Japan. And John III worked on cultural affairs, with the Japanese and trying to set up a system of cultural relations between Japan and the United States. In 1953, he played a key role in cultural diplomacy, pushing the Met and some very reluctant Japanese curators to hold a major exhibit in New York City and Washington. This was the first major post-war exhibit of Japanese art in the United States. It's interesting that once they were freed of the occupation, the Japanese curators did not want to send any of their best works to the United States. They were afraid of them. They were still angry about what the Americans had done during the occupation to take some of their great art and bring it to the United States. A couple of officers in the occupation were art historians from the Cleveland Museum, and they ransacked the place. And the Japanese had never forgotten about that. It took a cabinet-level decision in Tokyo and an American promise to use the U.S. Navy to transport the art before this exhibition was worked out. But John III, like most wealthy collectors, never had an eye for great art. And despite all he spent on his collection, it was not museum quality. Until he hired Sherman Lee, who was one of those occupation officers and later head of the Cleveland Museum and author of the most important book on the art of East Asia, of Far Eastern art. He hired him as a consultant. Lee built that wonderful small collection that John III donated to the Asia Society. It's a wonderful collection. It's worth seeing. But bear in mind, this is Sherman Lee's collection, whatever the name of it is. Only one piece of that entire collection came from the original Rockefeller collection, and that was probably a token so that John III would not feel completely left out of the whole operation. Now, let me turn to Roger Green. I fear some of you probably don't recognize the name. And if you don't recognize the name Roger Green, it's almost certainly because you never read my book, The Chinese Connection, which is subtitled Roger Green, Thomas Lamont, George Sikulski, and American East Asian Relations. Now, should you want to buy it, I still have 2 copies left. See me afterward. Green was a highly regarded young Foreign Service officer who grew up in Japan, where his parents had been among the earliest American missionaries. He saw enough of mission work to prefer some other kind of service to mankind. In 1911, at the age of 30, he was Consul General in Hankou when the Revolution of 1911 erupted. He received praise for his actions at that time from Washington and also from the Chinese, who considered him to be the only genuinely neutral consul in the city. So he had a terrific career to look ahead to in the U.S. government, in the State Department. In 1913, he was 32 years old, he was asked to accept, he was offered 2 positions. He could choose between being the Assistant Chief of Far Eastern Affairs in the State Department, or he could be Consul General at large for all of China. And he was thinking about these things and thinking about his obligations to the American government and his service to the American people. And along came the Rockefeller Foundation and wooed him away. He was convinced that he could be of great service to China, to the United States, by taking this position. And the salary was probably 2 or 3 times what he would have gotten working for the American government. So it was probably not a difficult decision. He became the China specialist on the Foundation's China Medical Commission, the goal of which was to study conditions for bringing first-class medical education to China. No one knows the story of the commission of the China Medical Board that followed with Green as the resident director of China, the creation of the Peking Union Medical College. Nobody knows any of this better than Mary. So you can read this book, and you want to read her earlier book as well. The title was what?
An American Transplant.
An American Transplant. And I think if you're interested in these things, these are 2 terrific books for you to look at. Now, there was one difference that existed at the outset of the creation of Peking Union Medical College. Mary has talked about how ecumenical John Jr. was, but the fact is that he saw the China Medical Board as an extension of the work of Christian missions. And he was committed to maintaining the Christian character of any institution that it built, for example, the Peking Union Medical College. Green clearly underestimated the depth of Rockefeller's conviction, but years passed before the explosion came and didn't come until the early 1930s. Part of the problem was the bad relationship that had developed between Green and John III. Green was contemptuous of Rockefeller's involvement in China Medical Board activities, and he simply refused to appease the young man's sense of his own importance. It's hard to be a Rockefeller and not have a sense of your own importance, and Green simply wasn't going to play up to that. But central to the differences was a quarrel over the Department of Religion at Peking Union Medical College. Green believed that the effort to instill Christianity into medical and nursing students was an anachronism in modern China. Increasingly nationalist, the Chinese faculty and students objected to the Department of Religion. And Green, under severe budgetary pressure in the Depression, viewed religious training as the most expendable element in the curriculum. I think we would be hard-pressed among us not to agree with that particular position. He fought for his beliefs. He was doubtless right. Almost everybody in China and the United States who were watching these kinds of things thought he was right. But being right was not sufficient when opposing the Rockefellers, father and son, over the direction of an organization whose existence depended on their philanthropy. And Green was forced out. Pressure to retain him came from Chinese and American educators throughout China. The Chinese minister in Washington lobbied hard to have Green kept on, to no avail. Now, here was another instance of what Mary, I think, has made clear in her book. The Rockefellers were generous in their philanthropy, much of it of enduring benefit to this day. But they were insensitive to Chinese nationalism, too determined to change China, to bring the blessings of Christianity as well as modern science. Well, in sum, this is a wonderful book. It's beautifully written and an important contribution to our knowledge of Chinese-American relations. If you're too cheap to buy it, at least read it. Thank you.
Warren, I don't think I've ever had an endorsement phrased quite like that. We'll now hear from David, frequently known as Mike Lampton. I'm sorry to report that Mike has never been the director of the Asia program here at the Wilson Center.
It's only one of my many defects.
But he seems to have prospered nonetheless. He is currently Dean of Faculty and Professor of China Studies and Director of the China Studies program at Johns Hopkins SAIS here in town. He is former president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, an organization that I mentioned a minute ago. A couple years ago, the Wilson Center, in partnership with the National Bureau of Asian Research out in Seattle, created a new organization called the National Asian Research Program. And we, this new organization called NARP for short, established a very prestigious award to recognize scholars who have contributed to America's understanding of Asia. We named this award for Bob Scalapino, and I'm delighted to say that Mike Lampton was the winner of the inaugural Scalapino Prize. So we claim Mike is part of the Wilson Center family, even if he wasn't here with us directly. Like others up here, he is a prolific scholar. I'm simply going to give you the title of one of his books because I like the subtitles so much. 2008, University of California published The Three Faces of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds. So, Mike, looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me echo the last words of Warren. This is a wonderful book, and I'm not to be outdone in terms of the enthusiasm of my endorsement on the back, so I'll leave it at that, but it is a wonderful book. This book is about, to my way of thinking, cultural internationalism, and in the vein of earlier comments, I think it does call for observation and I would say praise that the author of this book about cultural internationalism has lived the life in a sense that she's describing. It's already been listed, all of the boards and positions she's held relevant to this, but it just struck me how in describing the phenomenon, it was autobiography as well. And I think we're all enormously indebted to you, Mary, for all you've done, both in terms of scholarship, but organization building. And it isn't very often scholars are good at doing organization. And so I think that's to be noted as well. Four dimensions of this multi-layered book particularly resonate with me. First of all, I think it's interesting to juxtapose what this book is about with the current environment. If you think about the ambitions, it's really exhilarating that really a family would think about and mobilize its resources in changing another society and the degree to which they produced significant change. Their ambition, as Mary describes it, is to do nothing less than to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. And you kind of look at the paucity of ambition today, and I couldn't help but just think, where did we lose? Where have we lost this ambition? So that spoke to me. Also, I came rather later in my career to Johns Hopkins University. And this isn't an inadvertent or advertent plug for Hopkins, but it's absolutely central to this. And it's gratifying to see what a role a private university, once again endowed in this era of barons and titans, has played. I think the Hopkins model, the Flexner approach to medicine, really emphasizes the cultivation of skill, small classes, mentoring students. If you apply to the PhD or program, you're interviewed by professors and they decide whether they can bring something to you. A very different model and high standards. And that was what I think they were trying to bring to China. So I just went up a couple of years ago to Hopkins. The Chinese Student Association invited me to come up and talk to them. I thought, there might be 24 people there. There were several hundred in the room. I asked how many Chinese students and your families are part. This was all the medical apparatus, public health, and so forth. 2,000 people in the Hopkins community. So I think this has ripples even in terms of subsequent immigration patterns for advanced study and so on. So Hopkins is really, I think, a part of the story. A second thing that resonates is related to this because I think this book is about approaches to development in a way. How do you produce change in a society? And I admire Rockefeller for having a vision and pursuing it. It doesn't mean it's the only one. It doesn't mean it's right. But I would say the approach was a kind of trickle-down approach. Train the highest quality people you can who will train the trainers, and they'll replicate, and they'll know where the frontier is and keep pushing along. And this whole book, it seems to me, demonstrates that at least that was accomplished and, in fact, endured through a very long drought. Now, as Mary's book very commendably speaks, and which I believe, that's not the only approach to development, and by itself, it's lacking. There's certainly the more bottom-down, create basic public health, emphasize prevention rather than cure, and in a kind of, I suppose, dialectic way, Mao, in the Cultural Revolution, tried to bring that other component in. But I think, I think you need both of those components, and I think this is about one approach to development that was remarkably successful, though very incomplete in terms of the total health picture. Thirdly, Mary talked about epistemic communities in the book and in her remarks, and I was just struck, though, and I think I was pretty familiar, at least at a general level, with sort of the impact, but you can't help but be struck by how powerful that epistemic community was, how it endured all the, Great Leap Forward, anti-rightist campaign, Cultural Revolution, all of that. And I just happened in 1979 to go to China with Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare Califano to sign the first agreement in the Carter administration on a health agreement and education with China. And I'll never forget going to the Peking Union Medical, our first stop was to the Peking Union Medical College and the Academy of Medical Sciences. And who was the first person to extend his hand to the Secretary of Health? Huang Jia-se, who was graduated in PUMC 1933, a thoracic surgeon. And yesterday, preparing for this, I just thought I'd Google Huang Jia-se and see what other things came up. And what the first, I think, thoracic conference held, an international thoracic surgeons conference, was held in 1981. And who's there? And all of the many other graduates here. So they were not only part of establishing modern medicine in China, they were all part of the restoration of it. And they were the only ones really who could talk the lingo when we wanted to plug back in. And this was replicated in many ways. So I was just struck by the power of that. Mary also notes, and I would just emphasize that she sort of lays out an agenda for future research. And that is, at the time she was researching and doing interviews and so forth, I found in reading the book, I wanted to know more about how the Chinese processed all this, how they decided to react, what their calculations were. And I think there's a sequel book here, somebody's sequel book on how the Chinese processed this and so forth. I want to just conclude my remarks by saying also this book, while it's primarily about medicine and science, I think that ambition to change the world didn't apply just to China. I think the Rockefellers were very dedicated to the proposition of changing us. And if you look at the philanthropic institutions and where they donated their money in terms of building up the intellectual capacity of this society to study China, and the Ford Foundation deserves some credit in a later incarnation, but and Luce, and they're not alone, but it's really quite remarkable. If you look at the sort of topographical map of organizations, this is by no means complete, but you'd have to include the Asian Cultural Council, the Asia Society, the China Medical Board, the International Education Board, and incidentally, I didn't know it, even though I had been president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I didn't know it, but Rockefeller was the first contributor to it. So in any case, I would just end by near where the book itself concludes, is what struck me is in 1969, there was a convocation in New York City, which you talk about in the book, and the issue was, and one of the Kennedys was going to speak there, and Rockefeller was going to introduce them, but the issue was, should the United States begin thinking about changing its relationship with China? And Rockefeller III was introducing Kennedy and says, our thinking about that great country, meaning China, has been dominated by fear. We must not only understand China better, but we must understand our own fears. And I couldn't help but thinking, and you mentioned in your remarks, China's not the sick man of Asia anymore. And yet, I can't help think in our own way we've got a new set of fears that relate to that. So maybe his admonition in a different era about fear is equally appropriate today.
Good. Thanks, Mike. Thanks to all three of our speakers. I want to emphasize a phrase that Mike used. He described this as a multi-layered book. And indeed it is, with spades. First of all, it covers nearly 150 years. Historians, for a variety of reasons, tend to go deeper and deeper into more and more obscure topics covering a smaller and smaller period. So simply the notion of covering 150 years is pretty darn impressive. It's in part a multi-generational biography of a prominent family. It's a history not of a single institution, but of several Rockefeller philanthropies. But at the same time, and reference has already been made to this, the Chinese individuals and institutions in this book are not simply the recipients of American largesse. They are actors in their own right. It is, in fact, for all these reasons and others, really a very sophisticated book. But it struck me as I was reading it, it must have been a terribly difficult book to write. And before we turn it over to the audience, Mary, I wonder if you could just talk a bit about the challenges of writing this type of history. You're dealing, at least in part, with a period where documents don't exist, or they don't exist very much. Other parts of it, you're, I expect, simply flooded with too many documents. It's a history of two peoples and two cultures. It's a public history. It's a private history. Can you talk to us just a little bit about the challenges of writing this book?
Well, I started out wanting to write a short book, and I wrote a short book. So actually, this was a challenge. And I remember, I think, particularly Warren read an early manuscript of it. He felt I needed to put more of the Chinese context into the book. One of the most difficult things was providing enough information and knowing enough about the American intellectual context to know from whence did the Rockefeller ideas come. And then how do you know, they really dominated funding of, say, the social sciences in the United States in the first 50 years of this century. That's an important thing to know when they then are taking the social sciences to China. So how do you provide that? How do I know enough? How do I provide, you know, enough of a context on the American intellectual side? And similarly on the China side, how do you provide enough Chinese intellectual and political context without being totally superficial? So those were two big challenges. I remember going to New York on the train from here for one of my first trips when I was here to go to the archives, and I had read that there were Rockefeller diaries of China. And although I'd worked in this before, I'd never seen the diaries. And I thought, as I went on the train, I thought, you know, if they're diaries, if there really are diaries, I think I have a book. You know, I hadn't even seen the diaries. And when I saw the diaries and then read more of the family papers, I shifted my organizational idea to let the family story provide the narrative that links the different chapters. That was not my original intention, had not been to do so much about the family. But I found sort of the richness of the material, and it was easier to walk through 3 John D. Rockefellers in some respects than all the different foundation stories, et cetera. So those, I guess, are two parts to your answer.
Good. Let's open it to you. Sue has a microphone. I'm going to ask you to wait till we get a microphone to you, and if you'll introduce yourself and keep your questions or your comments brief, please. We'll go here. We'll go right down the line, starting here with Nancy.
Thank you. Nancy Berncroft Tucker, Georgetown University, and privileged senior scholar at the Wilson Center. Mary, you talk about a very successful effort to do for China, to be philanthropic and build institutions and help people. My question is a fairly contemporary one, is though the Chinese picked up on this and built their own institutions and used the money well, what it seems to me never did happen, and correct me because I hope I'm wrong, is that they never really adopted the model of philanthropy. That Chinese, for whatever reason, political or social or economic or cultural, did not follow in the footsteps of the Rockefellers, even once they began to have a good bit of money. And so I'm wondering, can you speak to that, and am I wrong? Is China changing?
One of the things I learned in studying this long period is if you take a snapshot at any one point in time, you're going to have a different answer. And so my first book actually judges much of this a failure because I was looking at it through the prism of the 1960s and the early 1970s. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to write a new book, was because I only could see this only over 100 years did you see that some of these ideas and some of these institutions really adapted and grew and took place. I think you may see the same thing with philanthropy because, first of all, one thing that scholars are discovering now is that there's much more Chinese tradition of philanthropy than we had given credit in the past. So there's a whole new literature on Chinese philanthropy, and it's not just lineage philanthropy. It is more universal, what we consider more universalist philanthropy. And you have a huge outpouring of now Chinese NGOs that are philanthropies, and they are studying American philanthropies. I'm going to a dinner with 10 Chinese billionaires who the Rockefeller brothers the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is trying to help train Chinese billionaires to give away money. The Ford Foundation has helped fund a council on philanthropy in China. There's a huge new interest that the Chinese have. So I think that, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, you might look back at this even Rockefeller legacy and say that was one of the models that they began to study.
Yeah, Jen next, and then we'll just go right down.
Yeah, Charge and freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. Mary, you may remember me.
I do remember you.
I come to your program quite often.
Yes.
In the old castle.
In the old
across
castle, right.
mall. Yeah. Four legacy you talk about. One is health of the people, and Dr. Lampton mentioned about they are doing is for the well-being of the mankind. And too bad to hear that they discontinue the activity. But I think that China most need today is the school of public health. And not easy to build a school, but also it's not easy to have the culture. So I think if with Rockefeller lead to build the public school in China, that's very neat. And Dr. Cohen, it's good you have served in the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. That's UMBC.
Correct.
You know what's the other name for UMBC?
Never mind.
You must be Chinese.
To know that.
I'm not sure there was a question there. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Nick Lardy from the Peterson Institute. Mary, I wanted to ask a very simple question. Those of us who are not historians and have not studied Chinese history very deeply have all, of course, read Spence's book on Changing China, and essentially one of the takeaways from your presentation today, and I haven't read the book, is that maybe the Rockefellers were an exception, that they were more successful than many of the cases that were profiled in that book. If that is a correct read of what you said, what are the things that accounted for their being more successful than other organizations, individuals over the centuries that had been less successful?
Well, first,
I
Jonathan.
already got the answer.
I didn't. What? Money? More money. Jonathan Spence published that book in the late '60s, I believe. And when I have students read that book, I ask them to think about the era, and it is a profoundly pessimistic book in terms of both what happens to the individuals in China. They're sucked up and they're unsuccessful, and they go home and they're not appreciated, and they have no impact on China. I think in the 1960s, with no exposure to China, in no sort of trajectory of what happened, you can understand why Jonathan wrote that book. But take Hume, the man who founded Yale in Changsha, who goes home, sad and embittered because his relations with the gentry are so bad and the mission board deserts him, etc. That medical institution is thriving. Mm-hmm. That medical institution honors him today, has a museum in his with lots of details about him. It stands today as a model institution for how a Sino-American cooperative program worked. So I think it depends on when we're looking sometimes at U.S.-China relations. I've often wanted to ask Jonathan, would he write the book differently today? I think we were all influenced by this book. Mm-hmm. And the phrase that always comes to me is that indefinable realm where altruism and exploitation meet. Mm-hmm. And sort of I revisit that, a lot. But I do think that we see today the legacy of American engagement in the Republican period in China in a very different way. And the Chinese partly, or mainly because the Chinese see it differently. I've been at any number of museums, Standard Oil Museum in central China. They're going to have a national museum on Standard Oil. Because this little town wants tourists to come, but they're looking for the historic record, et cetera. So, but in terms of the Rockefeller Foundation, they did not feel when they left in 1949 that they had been successful. They felt they had been successful in that the Chinese the faculty was all Chinese by the late 40s. And these were real stars even in the 1940s. So they felt they had a leadership group that could carry on PUMC. But the social scientists that they trained disappeared from view, very quickly in the 50s. And so if you read their account in the era, they did not feel so successful. I think it's taking the long trajectory of time that shows a different picture.
But even like Fei Xiaotong was part of that,
Fei
right?
Xiaotong was trained by
modern sociology,
yes. Fei Xiaotong,
right? So,
disappears from view. He was trained by Rockefeller funding and et cetera. And, he disappears. So I think it's what moment in time. I keep telling my students, look at the year the book was written, and what's going on then, and how does that affect your views of the period.
Wait a minute, are you suggesting that something we might have written is not truth for all the time?
I sure am.
Notwithstanding Nick Lardy's somewhat self-deprecating introductory comments, I don't think anyone in this room needs to be reminded that he's one of the best informed and most influential scholars in Washington. Over in the corner.
Thank you very much. I'm Kevin Quigley, and Mary, I had maybe I want to ask you an unfair.
Great to see you. Yes,
so it's
right.
great to see you again. Maybe this is an unfair question, and it's really about kind of the founders and donors' intent. And I was struck by Mike's comment about and your remarks about the world-changing aspiration of the Rockefellers, and that's in their DNA, and also the comment about their shift in their philanthropy away from elite-centric to much more grassroots-oriented, and also a shift away from a focus on China to other parts of the region. And I'd just like you to look forward and to look back and say, what would the founders think of those strategic changes in their direction?
What a fascinating question. This is a foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, unlike the Luce Foundation, let's say, is a foundation that hasn't, certainly in recent decades, cared very much what the founders thought. It has really, the motto for the well-being of mankind is so broad. It can be, interpreted in so many different ways. And in fact, foundation history there for the last 50 or 60 years is how much distance can we put between ourselves and the Rockefeller family. The recent appointment of David Rockefeller Jr. to be chair of the board is because they have a 100th anniversary coming up. And, they think, so for this foundation, I think the founders, John D. Sr., let it go. He didn't care very much about what it would all be about. Junior certainly believed in the concept of world science and world medicine and the internationalization. His own philanthropy, personal philanthropy, followed that path. He was one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Institute of Pacific Relations. He was dedicated to dialogue, a big supporter of the League of Nations, a big Republican supporter of the League of Nations funding. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the League of Nations Health Organization, about 50% of it. And so this was the culture of internationalism, I think, is the key element to the foundation. I think they've held on to that. The current emphasis on poverty, which the foundation have, is new. Certainly it's moved away from the trickle-down elite science, and their concern is both poverty in America and poverty abroad. This may be because their own interpretation of how a foundation can make a difference. I was struck by the cover of one of their recent annual reports. It has in huge letters, impact. And there's a picture, really, of someone like driving a stake, into the ground. The pressure, as you know, Kevin, on foundations to demonstrate impact has become really the name of the game, and it has to be demonstrated in a couple of years, if not the year in which it takes place. The Rockefeller tradition was long-term. Their decisions were for 20 and 30-year support. Even when they go back into China in 1980 and decide to work on agricultural biotechnology, the board votes a sum of money that will last for 25 years. They believe it will take 25 years to really develop and cultivate this field. Those traditions are almost gone in American philanthropy today. So I would say there are a lot of differences. This is, I guess, where I'm coming, as I think through this. A lot of differences from the original concepts.
Okay, anyone else?
One back there.
Yes, thank you very much for this excellent discussion, Barbara Pillsbury. Looking at PUMC and your description of it coming together, before PUMC, what was there? And what were the backgrounds of the Chinese individuals who came together to be the core that launched PUMC? And at that point in time, were there any other entities, any other foundations, any other rich families, any other actors who were also trying to achieve the same things that Rockefeller was trying to achieve with PUMC?
In around 1910, you had a fairly significant medical missionary presence and about 13 very small medical colleges. And what PUMC represented is the Rockefeller Foundation actually bought up one of the missionary medical schools and transformed it. And that is in part what Warren spoke to, the commitment that John D. Jr. made to the missionary societies he made in 1915 when they bought the property. At that time, you were beginning to have the first return Chinese medical doctors who had degrees from top-notch American medical schools. I think PUMC, the timing was very good because they were able to attract these young Harvard, Edinburgh, Johns Hopkins, Chicago educated MDs to be the leaders, the new Chinese leaders. But the original faculty was American. Were American specialists brought out for 5 years by the leading American medical people of the day. So in the beginning, it was much more of a hybrid organization. I'm not aware of any other sort of major financial family commitment on this scale.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to get the last question in. Bill.
Now I have to.
It's an easy one. Now, would you like to hazard
Please identify yourself.
Most worried about this question.
And any family relations?
Mary's my older sister. Would you like to hazard, maybe it's more of a guess, I don't know if anybody's done research, this elite sort of model, in a lot of ways you can understand it in medicine, the trust you build, the importance even the communist regime has on Western medicine. If they're sick, they want a good doctor. So building that elite kind of institution, I can see how that kind of survives, especially in medicine. But of course there's a lot of other non-elite activities, especially the other 14 mission college medical schools probably are not so elite oriented. You have hazard a guess as to which worked better, an elitist kind of philanthropy or a widespread public kind of philanthropy?
Of course, that's a central question. The missionary medical colleges graduated far more medical graduates than did PUMC. And the Rockefeller Foundation did put a fair amount of money into upgrading missionary medicine. It gave fellowships to half of the missionary doctors to upgrade missionary medicine. And by the 1940s, the doctors of all the missionary medical schools were serving in much broader places in China. But they also had a tendency to go into private practice, which the elite medical people did not. So there's really a bit of a trade-off there. And there's no question that the PUMC model was inappropriate to be a national model. It should have been a single NIH-type entity. That's the debate in China today, is perhaps to turn PUMC into NIH. Not that all the other institutions should look like PUMC. But what happened in the Republican period, and to an extent later, it became the model for everybody. So everybody wanted to be as good or to have as long programs. Today in China, you have hundreds of medical schools, and with 5-year programs, 3-year programs, 7-year programs. So you do have, it's made for a big jumble, but it has greatly improved the life, efficiency, life effectiveness of Chinese. So I think if you want to have a demonstration model, the elite model was very effective. But if you really want to ultimately disseminate, you need alternative models.
Mike, Warren, any last thoughts? No. Well, then I will call this event to a conclusion if you'll join me in a round of applause for all three of our speakers.